So research is maybe not the whole picture, and academia seems to have pretty important function in terms of like training. Although there are also like alternative models of research apprenticeship that are being experimented with by the alignment research community outside of academia. So it could be interesting to take the discussion in that direction. Personally, I'm very interested in that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, my general impression is that academia, like many long-running institutions, you could think of the church, for example, as being another one. They have a sort of like a headline purpose that it's like what you mainly think of that thing as doing. And I guess many people think of academia as it's mainly about teaching and research meaning publishing papers. But of course, a large amount of the energy of the institution is spent just propagating itself in a kind of error-free way in some sense, right? Like actually getting the ethos and the proper orientation passed on to the next generation in a way that doesn't just kind of degenerate into some lowest common denominator after 20, 50, 100 years. That's an extremely non-trivial task, and one of the things that there's a lot of tacit knowledge about how to do that in academia. It's maybe not talked about explicitly very much. I don't know that there's a book where you can go learn how that happens. But, you know, if you stay in academia, generally speaking, you've experienced that process either explicitly or implicitly, and you kind of get how to do it to a more or, to a lesser or greater degree. And so, yeah, it's interesting that mentorship is something that came up a lot over the 2 weeks in Berkeley. Hi, Adam.
Hi.
We were just to catch you up. We started a little. So I was in Berkeley for these 2 weeks, and that wasn't really an academic conference, or definitely was not an academic conference, although we did research and talked about research. So it was, most of the people there were, many of them were coming from academic backgrounds, like master's students, PhD students. I don't think there were any postdocs, maybe one. But it was sort of in the context of a kind of independent research community, which is how AI safety and alignment is sort of mostly organized. And one of the striking things about interacting with that community was the sense I got both from the young people, so sort of PhD, like just post-PhD kind of career stage, and also the more senior people, was that there was a lack of mentorship in that community, and a sort of a lack of a sense of multiple stages, career stages, sort of, and the ability of those to interact and the older people to pass on some understanding of the stuff that is more than research that goes on in a research community. And that's something that academia, of course, has figured out, whether or not it does it well, but that's part of the structure of academia, which is maybe hard to replicate because you don't exactly know how it works, like with many institutions. So yeah, the overall idea is that we'll talk today and for maybe a few weeks about new forms of research institutions, or just sort of quasi-academic institutions more generally. Rethink X I would classify as an organization of the kind that we'd want to talk about, for example. And that's partly stimulated by this experience in Berkeley. And I think there's a lot going on in terms of shift in the way that this kind of intellectual work gets done. And I'd like to understand better what has been happening and what the understanding is of how to do it well. So yeah, maybe we'll start with the mentorship. Do you have any take on like the differences within academia and outside academia when it comes to doing research, and how mentorship plays a role in that?
Sorry, Dan, I missed the last portion of what you were saying there. Can you just say that again real quick?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no problem. So just on the topic of mentorship. So it happens explicitly in academia with PhD advisors and so on, but past the PhD stage, maybe it takes more or less implicit forms. I mean, my PhD supervisor wasn't really a mentor. I was lucky to have maybe one or two people after that who kind of looked after me in some sense, and mostly by emulating them, I came to learn how to do certain things that are beyond research. So, of course, you have many influences on your actual intellectual work, but in terms of understanding the role that more senior people should play in organizing activities and looking after the younger people in various ways and that kind of thing. So that's something we learn often by just emulation or observing people we respect within an academic community. It's harder if there's not a culture of it. So, and I don't think there is a culture of it right now in, for example, the AI safety alignment community. People are trying to make it part of the culture, but I don't think it currently exists in a strong form, and that's to the detriment of that community, in my view. So I'm interested in your take within Rethink X, or just more broadly in the kind of think tank world, how mentorship works and how it's different to academia.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I certainly can't speak for all think tanks, but certainly at Rethink X and in my own experience, there's been a mentorship structure where junior analysts and researchers and scientists who come in do have they have a relationship to more senior folks in the organization that is similar to mentorship. Maybe perhaps it's not always formalized, but you've got people with more experience whose guidance you're benefiting from, and there's a little bit of learning by osmosis there, I suppose. I don't know how much of that is formalized. We have some formalization of it at Rethink X, without delving too far into the details, and I don't know how much, in terms of our official policy, any of it is not supposed to be disclosed. Like, I think we're probably pretty transparent about all of it, but I have to confess I don't know that I don't know our policy to the letter. But the general practice at Rethink X is that for new hires who come on, their supervision of those new hires by more senior folks, and so that, I suppose, does formalize some sort of relationship of mentorship there. But what's missing, I think, and what the universities certainly enculturated over generations, and I think, which is, sorry, I'm kind of backing into this a little bit with lots of preconditional clauses here, but I think we've lost some of that mentorship, and the reasons why are, in the case of the universities, a great culture was developed that included mentorship and supervision. Maybe it took a very long time. I don't know the history of the universities, how long the culture of supervision and mentorship took to emerge. But my understanding is that it was in place, certainly in the Oxbridge model, for a very long time. And when I was at Cambridge, it was still in place in the 1990s. I don't know how much it's changed. But what I suspect is that it is eroding. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I think it's eroding probably is at least partly as a function of technology and being able to operate remotely. So when I was at Cambridge in the 1990s, I was very, very quite taken by the intimacy of the relationship between students and faculty, how candid it was socially. Like students, even undergraduate students, would just meet professors at the pubs. And there was just so much socializing, a massive amount of just a great deal of socializing, and very, very much lubricated by alcohol, shall we say. So, lots of those formal barriers broken down, I think, not accidentally, quite deliberately. And that was part of the enculturation into the university, was the social dimension of it. And it was simply, part of that was necessitated by the fact that, this was the early 90s. you couldn't really function completely. You couldn't succeed certainly at all if you didn't do some of that socializing. And I suspect that as, working from behind a laptop has become more and more and more viable technologically, that social dimension of things is eroding. And my suspicion is that the mentorship and the supervision that goes along with all of that social bonding is eroding as well. That would be my first supposition there. So I am concerned, and certainly there was a big difference between my experience in the early 1990s, early 1990s in Cambridge, and then my experience in the early 2010s, so 15 years later, almost 20 years later at UCLA. And by 2010, it was, if you never wanted to talk to anybody and just see sort of your formally assigned supervisor once a semester, you could do that, and people got through the program like that. And that's really not a healthy way to go. So, but it was certainly possible. And I can't imagine without email and without, telephones and without that sort of, that just would have been impossible 100 years ago. You would not have been able to succeed 100 years ago doing that. And then I have one more thought. Sorry, just very quickly.
No, go ahead.
Which is that I think scale perhaps works against the university for that one-to-one mentorship, because when there were not so many masters and PhDs being produced by these institutions, I think probably it was more feasible to have faculty mentor individuals, more junior to themselves, and then for those more junior people to head out, take over roles as faculty members themselves, and then have that torch passed, and that cycle repeat and rinse and repeat. But even though we were able to grow academia globally an enormous amount in the 20th century, maybe we're now reaching the point where maybe we're approaching some saturation. I don't think it's unrealistic or unreasonable to say that more PhDs are being produced now than ever before, and that there aren't enough faculty positions for all of them. And so those PhDs then head off, and the cycle is broken, that cycle of mentorship, unless it's replicated somehow, say, for example, in a think tank. And so the growth and the scaling of the production of graduate students, I think I would say, maybe works a little bit against that very intimate mentorship model, in a way that when it was far smaller scale and far fewer numbers of people, moving through the university system, maybe that mentorship model was a little bit more viable. So those are my sort of initial thoughts on that, on that challenge.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that the difference between formal and informal mentorship has sort of already come up in multiple ways in this discussion, right? So you mentioned being assigned a mentor when you got to UCLA, and I've also had that experience of somehow there being a process that is supposed to pair people with mentors in every single case. Oh, actually, except one. The mentor I got, I didn't respect and didn't want to learn anything from. I'm kind of very judgmental and have many ways of deciding that I don't respect people. And this particular person didn't care about teaching and thought it was like beneath them. So I instantly dismissed them. And I could have learned something from them, no doubt. But I think the idea of being assigned a mentor just like makes my inner grumpy, anti-authoritarian Australian want to like kick and scream. Like, I don't want to be given a mentor. Fuck you. Like, I'll pick my mentor. Thanks. So the idea of like going, the pub format, of course, excludes lots of people who don't want to socialize that way. But the benefit of having it like mentorship emerge out of such things would be that somehow both the mentee and the mentor, it's kind of a consensual relationship, right? And in both directions, when it's part of a process, you just sort of get assigned someone to mentor, or you get assigned a mentor. Like personally, I don't think that's ever worked for me. And actually, I really hate systems that will give me people to mentor. because most people I don't care about. I care a lot about my students, and I will do a lot for them, but I choose my students. And I think that's part of the reason I care. So the idea of scaling mentorship by just like randomly assigning all incoming people to a mentor who's then like obligated in some sense to care about them, like I'm not going to do that. So I think it's an interesting, that's what makes it hard to scale, right? And I also don't believe that's effective. So I think it's a fiction that kind of works. Maybe you disagree, but so I think it's part of the reason it's hard to scale is that, well, it's hard to scale any functional consensual relationship that has to sort of be worked out between pairs of people, maybe.
Yeah, I guess I should distinguish. I had two different experiences. Three, including undergraduate at Cambridge. When I spent a year as a Fordham student in Cambridge for undergraduate, and I was assigned a supervisor, a mentor, or I was probably assigned to them, I suppose is a better way of saying it. And then the same was true during my master's program, where we received a supervisory assignment. We had it was called an advisor then, but it was, the same idea: supervisor, advisor, mentor. It goes by all these different terms. And as a master's student, the program that I was in had quite a large number of master's students. It was a big program relative to the number of faculty there were, and I'm sure the faculty were assigned, quite literally dozens of students to mentor, to supervise, or to advise every year for each new class that came in for the master's program. But during my PhD, it was different. And the thing that made it different was that identifying a potential supervisor was part of the application process for me in the social sciences and environmental sciences. So the programs that I applied to, all of the programs that I applied to, including the ones to which I was admitted, were ones where we were explicitly asked to identify faculty ahead of time, explicitly, note them in the application. I'd like to work with this person and so forth, and here's why. And if possible, to establish contact and a relationship with that person ahead of the application. And then in the application, you could refer to, well, I'm in touch with this person and we're having interesting conversations and we think we might work on these topics together and so forth. And then that was certainly the case when I was admitted to and accepted my program at UCLA. I knew who I was coming in to work with. So that was more of a consensual relationship. And again, that was something that benefited enormously from scale, because of course there were far fewer PhD students than master's students in those programs. And probably it was very close to the limit. They had, I'm guessing, let's see, in my PhD program, it was a small cohort. I think I was one of 4. And then in one of the years we had as many as 10. Mm-hmm. But that would have saturated the faculty because it was a pretty small, or at least in my very narrow, top disciplinary focus. They weren't 10 faculty members; there were like 5. So the faculty, and then of course PhD students are there for a number of years. So my guess is that each faculty member probably had somewhere between 5 and 10 direct supervisees. And I would imagine that's pretty much saturates you. Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
If you're figuring an hour a week per student, and I didn't always get that, but if you figure maybe something rule of thumb, you meet for an hour with your supervisor once a week. Well, that's 2 hours a day if you've got 10 students you're supervising, and that starts to be a fairly sizable chunk of a faculty person's day.
Yeah. Just the meetings. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's not like you don't get to think about your students at all outside of the meeting. Anything that you want to add, Matt or Chad or anybody else? Your experience with mentorship. Matt mentioned his experience with Chai, I think you're referring to there.
Yes. Also, that's how they do it at Kruger Lab for my upcoming internship.
Yeah.
So to clarify, so Chai, the Center for Human Compatible AI at UC Berkeley, and David Kruger's lab at Cambridge, both of these are AI safety labs, and they have a lot of PhD students, and they run internship programs for masters and PhD students and undergrads too, I think, from other universities to kind of come for a summer. But the PhD students are the supervisors in that case.
Yeah.
So in my previous internship, I was supervised by someone who's now finished their PhD. In my upcoming internship at Cambridge, it will be by someone who's currently doing their PhD as well. Another thing to mention is that at Chai they have this Slack channel and like these weekly meetings called pseudo advising, where the PhD students kind of pool mentorship. That they like, if your PhD supervisor is Stuart Russell, who's obviously a big shot in AI, I don't know that you're going to get weekly meetings with him. And that's the case at Chai for some of these students. So they kind of work together and share ideas with each other and kind of attempt to fill out that kind of mentorship need for each other beyond just their formal supervisor.
Yeah, I attended one of those meetings. It seemed to work pretty well.
I wish I could ask my grandfathers. Unfortunately, they've both passed away now. I could ask my father. Both of my grandfathers were professors, and my father got his PhD at the University of Michigan, where I got my master's. And I would be interested to know what their experiences were with like the distinction between mentorship and getting advice and benefiting from one another's experience between faculty and graduate students, PhD students, versus peer advising and peer sort of guidance and mentorship amongst the students. And again, how that's changed over the generations, especially the recent generations with technology. So, for example, when I was a student, the other PhD students were available for peer advising, and there was a forum, an online forum set up for that. And there were some aspects. Now that I'm thinking through this, it's been a number of years now, but now that I'm thinking through this, I'm sort of remembering features of it. One of which was that the PhD forum that we had, the online forum, one of its selling points was that it could be anonymous, so you could make anonymous posts. And the idea there was that would, it would encourage people to be more forthright in their, under circumstances. You could say something anonymously if you wanted. You could, report experiences that were negative and opinions that were not flattering of, whatever your own situation or faculty member interactions and so forth. But there was also and I was fortunate for this, in the building that I was in, there were dedicated PhD student offices, and it was sort of a communal office space. So we had like a whole, I know it was probably, I don't know, 8 or 10 rooms and a shared corridor and a lounge space on each end of the corridor. This was actually a fairly, in huge, principle, a fairly nice setup. It was very dingy because it needed some renovation love and attention. But in principle, it was a great environment, and a lot of the PhD students hung out there, and that was sort of a socializing opportunity, and also therefore a mentorship and peer advising opportunity. And I certainly took advantage of that. My wife certainly took advantage of that. Her program and my program happened to share that same space because we were in the same building, not the same programs or department, but the same building. Again, that was sort of a physical brick and mortar, I think, version. And I'm guessing that pre-internet, that's all there was in my dad and my grandfather's days. What else would there have been? There would have been that, and there would have been the pub. Perhaps there is something to be said for, in person, how would you do a, anonymous confessional or something? You couldn't, right? Not really. So maybe there are some upsides, some benefits to the virtualization of these mechanisms. But I think, I could count on one hand the number of times I ever even looked at the online forum. And I don't think I ever posted a question or answered a question there. So,
yeah, I think I want to distinguish between mentorship and, I mean, this peer advising thing, like what Matt was talking about. And I experienced one of those meetings when I was in Berkeley. That was a well-run, productive meeting, very smart people, mostly PhD students. I think there was maybe one postdoc there. They went around, spoke about what they'd worked on over the previous week or couple of weeks, problems they were having. People asked good questions. There was a couple of talks. That was a highly effective meeting. I don't think it's mentorship. So I'll give some examples of mentorship moments that have mattered to me. And one of my mistakes, I think, as a professional has been not seeking out more mentorship. And so I've had to make a lot of mistakes for myself and learn from them rather than getting input. And I guess I'm kind of stubborn in that way and not inclined to seek it out. So that's kind of one of my flaws. But a couple of moments that have really made a difference to me in terms of mentorship, they're like things that it's not just like having someone to talk to about your research. That's one thing. But and maybe that does count as mentorship, but it's not like clearly defined. But there's a really important role for mentorship in getting you to actually like make changes that you wouldn't otherwise naturally make, or to point out things that are a bit painful to notice. I went to speak at a seminar in Columbia, and there was a mathematician there, Kovanov. He paid attention to me for just a week, and I wouldn't say he really probably considered himself a mentor, but there was a couple of comments he made while I was there that really stuck with me, and they were quite cryptic. So he was clearly impressed by some of my work, but also felt like I was not pushing hard enough into doing really new things. And he made some comment at some point that I should look harder for things that aren't there. And he said it in like the middle of some other kind of cryptic remarks. And I knew exactly what he meant, which was that, when you're technically very good, you often kind of get stuck in a bit of a rut doing the things you're good at, and you get recognition for that. But it's also from time to time correct to, if you have the talent for it, take a shot at the ring, right? And do something actually really new, or at least try to. And often people need a bit of a push to do that, partly because they may be lazy, like we're all lazy, partly because they're a bit afraid, like we're all afraid. And often the role of a mentor is to help you reach your full potential, and in a way that is often quite uncomfortable. That's not going to happen at these CHAI meetings, nor is a PhD student going to deliver that to you, probably, because what do they know, right? I mean, how many times have they done that to themselves or done that to somebody else? So this is the kind of thing that I mean by mentorship, and it's what happens probably pretty rarely, but those moments can be very impactful.
Yeah, I certainly agree. The right kind of feedback at the right time can really be pivotal. And I think that this is not just true as adults in academia, but I think I don't believe I'm speaking out of turn here. I think this is a quite well-established phenomena at every age in the education process and in the maturation process for children, school-age children all the way on up into adulthood. Having good role models and getting good advice and guidance at the right times can be really very quite profoundly influential, and it have a very much a disproportionately outsized impact on the trajectory of a student if they get that advice at the right time from the right person. And it just sort of keeps them, I think it probably does a combination of things. You think of it a little bit like a vector, right? It can kind of keep them aimed in the right direction, in a good or positive or productive direction. And it can also kind of keep their momentum, keep keep the wind in their sails, as it were. And you need both of those things. You need to know where to be headed, and you need to have need to get a nice push, a bit of encouragement to get something to energize you. Both of those things, and if you get those, then away you go, and you're making real progress. You're moving ahead, as it were, metaphorically through some developmental space on a good trajectory. And if you don't get those things, you can either be stuck where you are, or you can get stuck down a cul-de-sac, or even lose progress, backtrack, as it were. Yeah. And so, and one of the things that strikes me immediately, especially if we sort of roll back the age from academia to younger children and think about education more broadly, is the potential of new AI tools to play an important role here. To be just very, very wise and savvy about how to nudge students with good mentorship to kind of keep them aimed well and keep them energized.
Yeah, I think that's true.
I'm sorry, guys, I have to step away for just a second.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know about AI as mentorship, misaligned mentor. Yeah, I think that's probably going to be true for positive reinforcement, but I think people often underestimate how important. I mean, one of the hardest things as a more senior person to do is to have difficult conversations with people about things that aren't going well and why, and sometimes you can see exactly what the problem is, or at least think you can, and pointing that out to people can be one of the most transformative, positive things you can do for them, but it's an extremely difficult thing to do well. I don't think I'd really trust AI to do that anytime soon, to me or to my child. Maybe it's not so necessary when you're really young, but I think that often people are, in terms of being really outstanding researchers, sometimes getting in their own way in a way that sometimes requires tough, straight talk. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I haven't had to do that so many times, but I can see the results years later, and they're quite dramatic. It's often the highest leverage moments you have in somebody's life as a teacher. Yeah, like Howard, I guess the AIs can be, maybe it's easier if it's coming from something that's impersonal as well, right? Like it's just like something is observing much of your work and has many patterns to observe from, and then it's like, okay, look, you're obviously this habit of thought or this behavior you have, or you're kind of shying away from the difficult things. Do you realize that? If it's not coming from a person, maybe, in those conversations, I often agonize about them beforehand, and I'm very careful to have my ducks in a row before I start. But an AI maybe can just deliver it in a less tense way, and so it doesn't have to be such a big deal. I suppose that's possible.
Well, I actually wonder if an AI sort of assistant playing this role, if it might benefit from not being an agent in its own right, in the same way that, like, the proverbial little voice in your head, or the angel and the devil on your shoulders, your conscience, these sorts of things, they're not, we don't, I don't want to speak for everybody, obviously, but certainly in my own personal experience and my impression of others is that we don't treat those as separate agents. They're just sort of, aspects of our own thinking. And it's metaphorical to say, well, there's this voice, my conscience is talking to me, and so forth. But the conscience that's talking to you isn't a fully independent agent who you have accountability and responsibilities and obligations towards, right? Mm-hmm. And one could imagine an AI sort of serving that function, like being the better angel of your nature and serving sort of a more explicit and turbocharged version of your conscience, as it were. And again, you wouldn't be so self-conscious with a mechanism that was not, that wasn't an agent in itself, but instead was so again, something that you didn't have the same kinds of responsibilities and obligations towards, but could serve that function as if you were in conversation, or at least partial conversation with it. And so I to me, I can imagine utilizing an AI as sort of a turbocharged conscience myself, and then I can also see it as in some effective roles for my kids for their education as well.
Yeah, but then who dials it up or down? It's like you're going to be every 5 minutes, the AI will be like, oh, you were really like not considerate in that conversation. Or like you checked Twitter again. Do you realize that like to get in the top 1%, you basically should only check Twitter once a week? Come on.
Yeah, I mean, I think people will probably have fun every day. People have fun with these things. I mean, the early stuff that I'm seeing, people are actively enjoying having the non-neutered chatbots that are snarky and abrasive and no bullshit kind of. I don't know, maybe that wears thin after a while, but it seems like people get a kick out of that, and maybe that's useful. I don't know if you guys have this in your personal experience, but when I've trained with people physically, so just athletics training, martial arts training, I've known a couple people who, when they're really going at it training, that little voice in their head comes out explicitly, and they start, they start yelling at themselves, pep talk kind of stuff that maybe is normally only in your own mind. Their inside voice, as it were, slips out into the outside voice. And I knew a few people who did that, who'd like, they'd really be going at it, and they'd, come on, and they're yelling at themselves. And I can certainly imagine those people wanting quite an aggressive, AI voice in their ear doing that for them,
So maybe it's meta mentorship we need, which is like how to dial up your mentor AI, like when to make it harsh, when to dial it down, give yourself a bit of leeway. Okay. Does anybody want to add more to that conversation? Otherwise, I think we'll switch for a minute to talk about different kinds of research orgs to just sort of get a lay of the land. Did anybody want to add something before we do that, though?
Yeah, I'd like to chip in. From the conversation, it seems like there are like a couple of different models of what a mentor could, like what relationship you could have with the mentor. Maybe this touches on, Rowan, I'm just reading your comment in the chat as well, that I think the relationship the mentee has with the mentor is very important when getting some kinds of feedback for it to be taken seriously. I don't think it come from an impersonal relationship. I think I agree with that comment. So, if you have a app on your phone that like sends you a notification that like reminds you to not check your phone, or reminds you, well, okay, that's a bit contradictory, but it tells you, sit up straight in your chair or whatever. The first thing that you're going to do is just like tune out that notification, and just like revert to your previous habits of sort of thinking or slouching in your chair or whatever. I think that you can, in principle, get an AI that has this kind of tact and this ability to kind of pick the right moment to just say, to have the difficult conversation with someone, if it knows, if it has the context from which to kind of, the same kind of context that someone who knows you well would be reasoning based on. So I think one model that seems to work is that if there's someone who knows you well and you respect them, and then they pick the right moment and they give you feedback, it can be transformative. That seems like one way that having an AI, if it sort of used that model, that it could work as a mentor. Whereas other models where, then if you have your sort of inner voice AI, like Adam was describing, maybe that's another model that can work. I don't know, it seems a little bit easier to maybe like just dismiss your inner voice compared to dismissing like a mentor that you respect. But maybe that's different for different people. But that could be like a second model. But I guess I'm skeptical of just coming up with some easy third model where you say, well, we'll just put the AI, we'll get it to say this thing in this context, and that will work. Because it really depends on the relationship in terms of how the feedback is going to be received and whether it's going to be sort of whether it's going to stick, so to speak. So,
yeah, I think it's also missing the element of emulation, right? So part of the reason people will take advice seriously, I'm thinking of myself taking advice from people. I mean, there are actually very few academics I've met who I actually actively wanted to be like. Right? My PhD supervisor is one. There's a handful of others, many others I respected, but I didn't especially feel like, oh, that's whatever that vector is, I need more of that. And those are the people who were in a position to, if they gave me advice, I would think about that a lot, right? And that would be enough for me to overcome whatever resistance I had to making the changes that they would say. And I mean, I think that applies for children as well, right? Ultimately, a lot of what happens in academia is sort of like you start at the kids' table and you want to sit at the adults' table, right? And you look over there and they respect each other and you respect them, and you sort of think, how could I be the kind of person that would get that respect? And then you don't know, right? You don't know how to do that. Maybe you have some ideas, you should work hard and you should do other things, but maybe you have a sense that there are other things you don't know, and you'll need to do those too. And that's the basis for which you're sort of receptive to advice. And I think that's very, I mean, yeah, okay, I guess I'm underestimating AIs in 10 years when all the humans are like on the kids' tables and the AI growth and geeks doing all the research, I suppose. Then you ask the AI growth and geek, how can I be more like you? And the AI growth and geek says, oh, I've got bad news for you, meatbag. Here's a few things you might attempt. But yeah, it's sort of like the aspect of emulation seems important.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess it's harder to imagine an AI as a role model, given that the roles are very different.
And the limitations are different.
Yeah, it might be interesting to kind of, be a little formal or systematic about it and break down the kind of the different buckets of utility that a supervisor or mentor actually provides. Mm-hmm. And those would be metrics on which you could, evaluate. Creating a bit of a matrix here, and a table, as it were, and see which which categories or forms of usefulness can you get from different kinds of mentors? Could you is it even conceivable you could replicate all of those with AI, and so forth? The role model thing, hard to see how an AI would be something you could aspire to emulate. Although, having said that, fictional role models are not, those are not ridiculous. I mean, superheroes and literary figures and all the rest of it. Plenty of us are and always have been inspired by legends and myths and fictional characters. But nothing beats a good real world role model, I suppose, especially again for young children. And then the another, for example, big thing that in my mind AI could really do is kind of tip your attention mechanisms, like recalibrate them, giving that recalibration, which I personally found very useful in my mentorship experiences, where it was just good to check in and just make sure, okay, I'm on track, I'm focused, I'm moving in the right direction, I haven't lost sight of anything, I'm reminded that I was going to be thinking about these things, and I remembered to spend enough time thinking about those things and so forth. And I suppose that's almost more of personal assistance than mentorship per se, but I suppose it's something that a good mentor would do, is help you stay organized, stay focused, and attend to some optimal set of things you should be paying attention to, as opposed to losing track, flailing a bit, getting lost. And certainly I've had my own fair share of getting lost as well, but I certainly saw students get lost, and founder a little bit as well. And some sort of intentional function is there, as well as role models. And then what suppose what would be some other so other things are just sharing, not necessarily experience, but when I'm thinking about peer review or peer advice, it would be, don't make this mistake that I made. And that's not necessarily a role model. It's more like just, just sort of taking advantage of the experience of others, and avoiding making unnecessary mistakes. And maybe an AI could do a little bit of that as well. And sometimes it's probably effective if it's shared very personally. Maybe sometimes it's effective if it's shared in the abstract. I can imagine those are quite different things. Someone's telling you, listen, here's my whole personal experience, learn from this, versus, okay, here's a list of do's and don'ts, don't do this. Those are two quite different types of content, but I suppose they achieve a similar goal ultimately, which is to keep you out of trouble as much as possible. And certainly that's part of mentorship, is helping you avoid pitfalls.
Yeah. I think we'll return to this topic. Maybe I'll just bookend it by saying that I think that it is generally underappreciated when people talk about scaling research or research organization or whatever. It's generally underappreciated the extent to which this functions, where it functions in academia, say, partly on the back of tacit and poorly understood culture that is hard to transplant and hard to engineer. A lot depends on things that don't appear in formal processes or web page or forums or whatever. So paying attention to exactly these things we were discussing seems not incidental. It seems rather like actually the core. So let's talk about research organizations. Maybe this makes like a bunch of, let's like make a list of the kinds of ways that research takes place in the world today, which is incredibly varied. We've spoken a bit about sort of academic institutions. That ranges from universities, there are different kinds of universities, different kinds of organizations within universities. I think maybe it's enough just to leave it as university for now. Let's see. There's government institutions that perform research. I don't necessarily have some very narrow definition of research. I think if it's just purely passing on existing knowledge with no interest in generating new knowledge, then maybe I'm not so interested in it. So anything that involves as part of its core function the generation of new knowledge, I think is any kind of knowledge, I think is valid here. Government institutions, there's NGOs, that refers to often a certain kind of non-governmental organization. I guess think tank I tend to think of as a different bucket to NGO. Maybe that's a mistake. What are some of the other examples? How would you classify Rethink X, for example? That's a think tank, or does it need a name?
Well, we sort of straddle the NGO and think tank labels. There are some pros and cons to each of those categories. Sometimes we don't like to be painted with the think tank brush. Sometimes we're.
What's the distinction?
We do well. The think tank model. It's easy to assume that think tanks are functioning in ways that are shaped by their funding and revenue, and it's basically their business models. And this is one reason why think tanks are often partisan, is because their business model will be catering to a specific audience, and that's where the money's coming from. And so you're basically needing to tell that audience what they want to hear, and so that you see think tanks often tend towards having a certain kind of voice that is speaking to a very specific audience, and that is, shaped by the financial incentives that are at work. And if you're an NGO, you can avoid some of that because the more of the assumption for an NGO will be, well, an NGO is mission driven. And not all NGOs, of course, some NGOs are self-sustaining and have sort of, produce competitive products and services for open markets, certainly. But many people are more. I think there tends to be a more widespread perception of NGOs being mission driven and think tanks being sort of audience driven. I think I would say that. And in the case of RethinkX, we are mission driven and attempt to be, to the extent that it's possible, non-ideological, apolitical, certainly nonpartisan, and we are an NGO. We literally operate as a nonprofit organization, and not all think tanks do. Some think tanks are for-profit organizations. So they sort of straddle, they have a foot in the consultancy industry as well. And we don't. RethinkX is not a consultancy. We do not, we don't have paying clients for whom we produce reports. So it can be a little tricky. I think that there, for as far as research goes, the one thing that's missing there are private enterprise. I mean, some of these big companies, they're for profit but they have big R&D labs and operations, and I guess that would be what private or industry research, corporate. And of course, a lot of the action in AI is happening in those, specifically in those types of research organizations.
Yeah, I don't actually know.
You guys know so well.
I think corporate lab has a different sort of reading to, like, I find it hard to describe OpenAI as corporate lab, because corporate lab tends to mean like there's a separate research org that's sort of within a larger profit-driven corporation. OpenAI is certainly profit-driven. I think that's fair to say, although it's not. I mean, it's a complicated story, and I think one shouldn't be too cynical about it, but it is ultimately aiming at making money. Nonetheless, is a lab. Focused research organization is an interesting kind of newfangled thing. I think in many respects, maybe not new, but the term itself refers to it's kind of like you imagine a university lab that's sort of been spun out in order to pursue some particular thing that wouldn't happen within a university and also wouldn't happen in a for-profit company. The funding arrangements can be a little unusual. Maybe we can spend a whole seminar talking about that at some point. I think it's quite interesting. But medical research. Yeah, right. So pharmaceutical companies, of course, are huge research enterprises.
What about, I don't know if it falls under NGO, but what about crowd and open source and just general public, crowd Kickstarter type, maybe not even Kickstarter, but just less formal than that, but, Wikipedia, wiki style, open source software style development where these are happening on open public forums. Nobody's really getting paid. It is mission driven, but it may not even be funded more than just the cost of having.
Is that research exactly?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, what would you call like the work that was, the work, quote unquote work of the Less Wrong community on AI safety for many years before any of it was formally funded. I mean, it was a crowd that was doing that work, and maybe that isn't legitimate research, but was there no value to it at all? I mean,
but there are billionaires standing behind that, so it's not exactly.
Yeah, but it didn't. I mean, what did it need? I mean, it needed like $50 a month for the website, and that's it. I mean, then other than that, it's just social media, basically.
But hosting a web page,
bunch of people talking.
It's a different thing to research, right? So certainly building infrastructure like Wikipedia or Less Wrong has facilitated research, but I think that isn't. Well, I guess it's an open question. Like, if somebody's just on a forum, chatting or commenting, comment threads, chat threads, posting their own stuff. You see this on various. All kinds of things over many, many years now. Going back to the BBS days, and then Slashdot being an early example, and things that are still alive now are things like Reddit and whatnot, and Twitter and so forth. And
and then sites like Less Wrong and Rational Wiki that specifically host the content. People do make a pretty good effort to post reasonably decent stuff there, and then it gets torn up by peers, criticized, and so forth, and then it's mimetic, right? It gets memed, and ideas that have some sort of mimetic survival advantage, as it were, tend to persist and become part of an lexicon that the community then uses and builds upon. And in a way, that is, that's research of a kind. Certainly for something like, in the early days where it's purely abstract and theoretical, and there's not a whole lot of, empirical stuff necessarily being done. That's what the AI safety crowd was doing 15 years ago. And in the absence of any other formal research, it's hard to say that was nothing or useless. It was, maybe it wasn't ideal, but it didn't cost much of anything other than people's time and contribute their own time. So
I think some of that, certainly research does take place there. I guess maybe I'll draw a line at kind of more sustained. I mean, it's someone's like part-time or full-time job. Planker makes a good point. I mean, of course, back at the beginning of the scientific revolution, I mean, who was doing scientific research? Well, there was a few different kinds of people. I mean, if we take like the beginning development of the steam engine, for example, there's several great books about that. And if you look at them, you'll see the people involved either were already rich and they just had to choose where to spend their time, and some of them spent it doing research and tinkering and building things. I mean, there's a sort of a continuum between the pure scientific research and the kind of more engineering-driven work. Often the former were often people with independent means or funded by people with independent means. Often there were positions like tutor or like Leibniz's position. He wasn't independently wealthy, but he sort of had various positions in courts and was going around, made a living for himself doing that. There was a lot of that. Then there were people like Watts, who funded the development of the steam engine from basically a grant from a rich industrialist who wanted to develop the technology. And basically the relationship, I think his name was Black, if I remember correctly. The relationship between Black and Watts is kind of a bit like the relationship between Google and DeepMind, I would say. So someone sort of spies an opportunity for an entire industry to be transformed by a technology and invests in it in order to capture some part of that and get in there early. That's in the West. I mean, I guess research has taken place in many different places and many different forms. But so in China, it was also the purview of the kind of bureaucrat class who had free time, and it was also a status thing. So competing for status has always been a motivation for performing research, I guess. Showing off that you could do this and that with Euclid was like how you proved you were better than other rich people, I guess, in some corners of the world for a while. Rowan asked earlier about an example of a focused research organization. Yeah, actually, I don't have one that comes to mind. I had a couple of links that I was looking through, but I don't remember any of the names. I don't think there's a bit of a blur between that and venture capital-driven research organizations. You can go look at the Flagship Fund, which is a Silicon Valley-based venture capital firm that funds a lot of health and drug discovery-oriented startups. They're, I would say, probably focused research organizations, so they have a particular research hypothesis, and then they get funding to develop it, and if IP comes out of it, then that IP is like partly owned by the venture capitalist. So there's a big one that got started a few years ago by George Church and collaborators around using deep learning in connection with protein generation, sort of using large language models and so on to generate new proteins as sort of tools in drug discovery. So that's quite common in pharmaceuticals, drug discovery, health. Outside of that, I don't know how. I mean, it's become quite a thing over the last 5 years, 10 years. But outside of that, I'm not sure how common that is.
I mean, I can see some blurring. I mean, again, there maybe the borders and boundaries between these categories are porous or a little unclear, shall we say. For focused research organizations, I can see that blurring into certain types of corporate research. Certain a company set up to solve a specific problem and receive funding to that for that aim, without actually producing a product. I mean, that sounds like a lot of startups. Which may be a little bit different than a corporate lab in a large existing company with other revenue streams that's upon which its finances are more primarily based than venture capital investment, for example. And then in the academic institutions, there's crossover as well with privately funded research institutes that are given a home or are partly within the fold of the academic institution. And those are a little bit different than departments and colleges of certain sciences that would be where those institutions are hosted. But scientists, researchers can do research and be supported by the university and by the department purely. And then they can, and with funding coming in from a variety of sources, including government, and including private funding, scholarships and so forth, and fellowships. But then you do have these research institutes, and those are their own entities within academic institutions that are, again, a little bit different, and they often have maybe a specific focus, maybe a topical concentration, and a mission. Sometimes they have a mission. They're actually trying to solve certain types of problems, or they're focused on a given domain of inquiry for in the pursuit of a larger objective or goal. So yeah, those research institutes, they're kind of in their own little category there, I would say.
Yeah, where would we stick MIRI on this list, or is it a new category? So I think we all know who MIRI is, what MIRI is. So I visited Constellation in Berkeley, which I don't know if that is where MIRI is housed, but Redwood Research, which is another AI safety research organization, and a few others around in Berkeley. I think they're probably NGOs on this list. Certainly mission-driven. Yeah, maybe, okay, unless we have more to add to this list, maybe we can talk about, and Adam touched on this already. Obviously, the behavior and priorities of these different forms of research organization are very strongly driven by their source of funding. So that determines how long-term versus short-term they are, whether they're audience-driven or mission-driven, the extent to which they're aiming at sort of predetermined outcomes. You could say how corrupt the research process is. To take an example, pharmaceutical organizations, obviously they spend a lot on research. Most drugs don't work. By the time they've got a drug to market, they might have spent hundreds of millions on developing that. That's a very different profile of risk and reward to an academic doing research who is primarily motivated, unfortunately, by publishing papers, rather than getting to the truth often, which, there's often very interesting conflicts at the borders of these kinds of institutions. So to name one, the often drug companies look on academic research as like potentially useful, but generated by pathological liars or something. So they often have the experience of finding that published research is just garbage. Everybody knows that a lot of published research is not true in the sciences. You sort of need to have the inner networks to know what to trust and what not to trust, which is unfortunate, but that's the state of affairs. That's driven by the incentive structure of academic institutions to a large degree. It changes over time. It maybe wasn't this bad in the past, but maybe had different kinds of problems. NGOs, I suppose, are sometimes funded by philanthropic efforts from rich individuals or groups that maybe gives them a longer time horizon, but also maybe constrains their activities in ways that are harder to see. Any other takes on where the money comes from in these different examples and how that shapes them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two, broadly speaking, there are two major categories of financial incentive. I would just say that they are sort of direct / primary and indirect / secondary. And the secondary incentive is the one that really scales. And this is what venture capital is all about. So for primary, those are like the funding comes in as a grant or just direct funding, and you get paid as a researcher. Your financial incentive is kind of granular down to the individual researcher getting a salary and the equipment that you need to do the research getting paid for and so forth. And that scales directly with the number of individuals who are involved in the organization. That stands in stark contrast to financial incentives that are aimed at building or achieving a result that can turn into a product or service that's scalable, and that then can be the basis for a extremely rapid growth enterprise, and then an equity share, some ownership share of that enterprise will then be enormously valuable if it scales. And of course, this is what venture capital is after. And many people who are doing research in tech, individual researchers, workers, salaried people are also motivated by any, stock options or equity options or kind of equity-based compensation that's available, because that equity can scale so much more, orders of magnitude more than their sort of direct compensation can scale. And so I think those are sort of two very fundamentally different types of motivation. Financially, one is, we're directly just going to pay for this research to get done. And the other one is, well, if this research pays off itself, then it can Shazam have, produce this new enterprise and start hoovering up economic rents from, the global economy and, make everybody rich. And that's different. Those are two very different sets of incentive, I would say. I mean, I don't know exactly how to. I'm sure there's a formal way to describe this in the enterprise business management finance literature. I'm sorry, I don't know what those terms are, but I would certainly, in my own personal experience, that's how I tend to look at the sets of motivations. Yeah, and then the last thing, sorry, and just before I forget, Dan, I was going to ask directly, where would you put metauni and these seminars and the kind of, I mean, is this, I don't know if you're thinking that research gets produced here, as certainly there's education and there's intellectual life happening, but you're writing new stuff on these boards that's genuinely novel. And it could be compiled and turned into research and legitimately called research. And so what is this? What model is this? Does it fit into one of these modalities you've already explicitly, included in the list here, or is it something different?
Well, at the moment, everybody who's participating here puts bread on the table through some other pathway, right? So you have PhD students, you have academics, you have yourself. We're meeting here, and that's the purpose of metauni so far. So I don't think it's generating. I mean, it's facilitating new knowledge, I suppose, to a degree. And there are conversations here that generate new knowledge, but largely speaking, it's work that's taking place within one of these kinds of institutions, and we're benefiting from the sort of cross-pollination and the interaction of people sort of performing research activity under one of these umbrellas. Maybe over time, metauni could be something else, but to be clear, I'm not I think that is an interesting question. metauni probably will grow and develop in some way that maybe facilitates its own research happening in some form. I don't have any clear vision on that, and this discussion isn't really aimed at informing any particular decisions around that. But it may end up being relevant. But at the moment, yeah, I don't think it really counts as its own research organization.
Okay. Yeah. I think you might be selling yourself a little bit short. I mean, I guess you could back up a little bit further and say, well, what is legitimate research? How is that defined? And what is, because like you were just saying, universities and formal academic institutions, they have an long established reputation for producing legitimate research, but we also know they produce a lot of hot air too, a lot of fluff, a lot of rubbish, and they provide forums for the exchange of ideas, and then people go away and do their own work in their own homes and sometimes in laboratories, but certainly of their own recognizance. And so I don't know, that doesn't seem like it's fundamentally superior or fundamentally more legitimate than what happens here. But
yeah, I think that's true. I think it's not like there's a line in the sand. On the other side is like a real research org, and metauni is on this side. It's maybe a matter of emphasis and attention and the priorities of the people involved. So I visited Topos Institute in Berkeley. Some of our lectures were hosted there. Topos Institute is a bunch of mathematicians, computer scientists, and sort of related people who have some kind of funding and basically set up a sort of quasi-academic. I mean, the internal culture is very academic as compared to, say, MIRI, which is academic in a different way.
For now, this laying out research in terms of financial motivations and incentives and flows is fine. But I do wonder, what I mean, it's certainly conceivable that the work could get done just by people volunteering their time if they weren't getting paid. So if everybody was independently wealthy, or if society were prosperous enough, for example, in some conceivable alternate universe or future, you wouldn't necessarily have these same financial incentives, but the research work would still get done. And so I don't know if that aims us towards new types of organizations going forward, or whether one of these is going to win in
sorry, can you
as we move forward. I'm not sure.
What's driving the change there?
Well, the cost of research is two. Well, it's two things really. It's the cost of the people involved, and then it's the cost of whatever materials and equipment, capital, and expenses that you've got to undertake the research itself. But and I suppose ultimately you can reduce a lot of that down to labor. But one could imagine a condition in the not too terribly distant future of where economics is dominated by abundance rather than scarcity, and largely automated or nearly fully automated economy. I think you're sort of Star Trek kind of scenario when just scientific research happens at the Daystrom Institute in Star Trek, but nobody gets paid because nobody needs money, because money is not worth anything in a post-scarcity society. So they obviously don't have the same kind of incentive structures. And I wonder if is the Daystrom Institute a descendant of the academic institutions, or a descendant of the corporate lab, or a descendant of the think tank? Well, what is it? I mean, that's my joke. I'm jokingly, wondering what that is.
Yeah, I think when I got kicked out, I was saying something about the Topos Institute, which might be interesting to finish. It's like a little group of academics or people who have left academia, but by and large, at least the senior people are very high quality, so they could have had academic careers and they chose not to. It's got a range of funding, but I think the situation may be a little bit like Rethink X, as I understand it. So maybe there's at the core of, at the beginning at least, there was a substantial philanthropic gift to get it going, basically coming out of some of the relationships and that the founding scientists had. And now it's moving in a direction where they're trying to make some more recurring revenue from having some kind of products. As I understand it, I could be wrong about that. They have a roadmap on their webpage. It's not like it's a secret. Yeah, so that's very difficult to do, though, and unclear whether they will succeed in making it a sustainable thing. It's easy to dream about that or think it might be fun. In reality, maybe you end up doing even less research than you did in academia if you're trying to do something like that. But it is an interesting model. It occurred to me when you asked about metauni being a place where research happens. I mean, for that to be like seriously true, there would have to be some kind of independent funding for metauni. It's very unclear how that would work, right? Are there any other? Maybe we can talk more about the independent example, sort of the landscape of AI safety research. I don't know, Matt, you want to pick that up? So what's the division between the gig economy and the people with tenure, so to speak?
Yeah, so John Wentworth, who's like one example of successful, established independent researcher in AI alignment, has a post on Less Wrong, which I'll maybe put in the Discord, that kind of lays out this model. My understanding is that you basically you apply for funding through this is in the effective altruism space. I don't know about other spaces. Potentially it's possible to do this in other ways. And I had a message in the chat earlier about, I wonder if there's like a crowdfunding version of this. But anyway, about in the effective altruism space, there are these various funding organizations that you can apply for grants to as an individual. And what sets them apart from other academic grant-making bodies from the government or from, I don't know, whatever other places you apply for grants to as an academic, is that the funding is mostly coming from philanthropy, but more the sort of turnaround times are meant to be much faster, and that there's sort of an emphasis on cutting out like selling your research and kind of just being more honest about it, and just sort of they describe it as like a two-way, no bullshit grant process where you just straight up explain what you're working on, why you think it's important. You explain what your kind of key uncertainties are, and so on. You kind of try to be honest about that, and then they won't take like years to get back to you. They'll get back to you in like a couple of months, or recently there's been a few attempts to start grant making processes that are even faster, on the order of weeks.
Yeah.
And I recently got a grant for a small 6-week independent project where I talked to someone about the project, they read my proposal, and I had the money in my bank account by the end of that day, like less than 24 hours later. For my 6 week salary, like in my bank account. And so, yeah, it's getting, I guess it can be pretty fast. And that's one of the selling points of this. But the model is that you sort of go for short-term grants like this, maybe 6 months to start out as an independent researcher or something like that. In my case, I had a specific 6-week project, so that's not the same. But if I was going to try and turn this into like a career, I would say, well, would you please fund me for 6 months to work on this? And I'll try and establish like a track record. And then 6 months later, I'd ask again for another 6 months, or eventually for 12 months at a time. If you establish yourself in the community, like John Wentworth, I think then you can kind of ask for, you probably still ask for like a year or two at a time, but you maybe have more of a kind of confidence that you'll get the funding. And so for people that are kind of not John Wentworth, I think that's the main uncertainty, is like the insecurity of this because at any point the people who are evaluating the grants could just no bullshit tell you, well, sorry, we don't think your research is good enough and we're going to stop paying you and you have to do something else. At least that's my fear.
Yeah,
I haven't really spoken to that many people who do this, and I'm not sure how often that happens, but yeah.
Yeah, I got to talk to Wentworth a bit in the meeting, but only on scientific topics, and I'm very curious to ask more about how this works. But I mean, that's not so different to how postdocs work, right? So you sort of go around, you say to a committee, okay, here's what I'm doing, and someone hopefully gives you a job for a year or two or three. This is not like this is not a good way to live, like long term. It wrecks people, to be blunt. Often, I mean, in this case with this community, I guess you don't have to move around to where the funder is, but probably if you want to do it long term, you have to be spending quite a bit of time being plugged into the EA networks, right? How else are you going to follow the winds and know how to arrange yourself over a longer period of time? I mean, the whole point of tenure in academia is to, in principle, remove the incentive to be following the fashion in order to secure, continuous short-term research contracts, and give people the leeway to make big bets and to think long-term. This community, the EA community, thinks it's prioritizing long-term research and difficult, like non-legible things or whatever. But in terms of how they actually fund people, I don't understand how that is actually true, apart from like just hoping that the funders themselves have long-term vision and so on.
Well, I mean, the idea of tenure and sponsorship goes back a very long way historically, right? I mean, and it was this because this is a perennial problem. Like, how do you earn a crust, and how do you secure your basic needs for some reasonable amount of time, on some time horizon that then frees you up to actually do work that isn't just that takes a longer investment of time and focus than just something short term that it will generate a fairly immediate response or result, I guess is a better way to say it. And I mean, I think patrons and patronage models are they're very old, and then we've seen some new takes on these in the modern era, where you can get groups of people or individuals sponsoring or patroning individuals or teams that are that they are excited about or support for one reason or another. And I don't know if there's a sort of a scientific research equivalent to Patreon, for example, but Patreon is the biggest sort of name that I'm aware of in that general sort of patronage sponsorship model space. I'm sure they must have at least a couple of competitors that have probably slightly different spins or focus. I don't know all that much about Patreon. I think it's mostly about sort of, my impression is it's mostly about media content productions. People who have a show or a podcast or producing some sort of consumable entertainment product or service are, they get subscribers. And, if you get 100 people paying, $10 a month, then, that starts to add up to real money. And if you get enough subscribers or enough supporters, enough Patreons, I guess it is, then that can give you the financial independence you need to be a producer of whatever the thing is that you're producing that people find to be of value. And maybe there is, I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked into it, but maybe there is a scientific research equivalent of Patreon. And it would, I mean, if you were, I can imagine it being structured a little bit differently, but one could imagine, there are a relatively small number of producers who have, good qualifications or accolades or otherwise show quite extraordinary promise. And then you could have a comparatively smaller number of supporters with much deeper pockets. And it could be something like, okay, well, the millionaires and billionaires of the world should be subscribing to these individuals or perhaps small teams, but not with $5 a month, but for more like, $5,000 or $50,000 a month or something like that. And then that would give, with some contract, like, 3-month minimum or 6-month minimum or something. And then you could imagine some modern model of sponsorship or patronage that could be an alternative to the the standard models of, okay, got to go out, got to get a job. Again, who's hiring? One of those types of organizations Dan wrote on the board. I'm going to go down the academic career track. I'm going to work for the government. And you make trade-offs about, you make trade-offs between your financial security and your academic or intellectual freedom to choose what you want to pursue and so forth. And maybe there is room for a new kind of patronage or sponsorship model to provide an alternative, perhaps in that independent/freelance category. So
yeah, my impression is that
I could simply be ignorant. This is probably all already exists, is my guess, and it just isn't something I'm aware of. But
I think that's what roughly some of these EA affiliated funding organizations are really aiming at. So, Lightspeed, I think, are they the one who gave you the grant, Matt?
No, it was another new one called Manifund, which is actually,
right.
I don't fully understand it. It's related to manifold markets. I think they're trying to be some kind of like prediction market for grant making.
Right.
I don't know. But anyway, yeah, they gave me money, so I don't care.
Yeah,
I think the distinction I'm making is important, and that's between, patronage and sponsorship versus grants. So grants are a gig, and gigs suck, as you were saying, Dan, and it's no way to live. It's very, very painful, very difficult. The gig economy is merciless and miserable. It's ancient, of course. It's probably the oldest, but it's almost certainly the oldest way of making a living is just, one day at a time, one gig at a time, one opportunity, one job, one task at a time. And that's horrible. And society made a massive leap forward in securing careers for people. Because the stability that provides individuals and from their families and from their communities and from your entire society. So it's massive, massive benefit to the security of moving past a gig. And the gig economy was being talked up to quite a lot of fanfare, a decade ago or whatever, when it was at its height. And I was certainly one of those people who was quite bitterly cynical about it being progress for society. I always thought it was quite awful. The Patreon, for example, is often specifically positioned as an alternative to the gig economy because it is a subscription and you just you've got it's crowdsourced and people are not necessarily committed long term, but you know what you're going to get month to month to month to month, and it's not just okay, well that project's done and now the funds dried up and now I've got to shift gears and go write some grants and get the next gig. And even in academia, unfortunately, tenure is great, but not everybody's got tenure. And even people who have tenure are often spending so much of their time chasing grants for their students or the labs or whatever.
Yes.
That it's really quite an awful existence, which is one reason why I'm so fortunate. I don't do any of that. So I just, I have vastly more freedom because I have security financially. The way that Rethink X is very, very privileged to be structured is we just have great philanthropic support.
Yeah. I guess we'll have to wrap up in a minute, but I'll maybe end by asking a question about what you just said, Adam. So if you're paying on Patreon, you're supporting a researcher, what do you get? I mean, apart from like 5 years from now, feeling that you were 1/1,000,000th of the discovery of, X, Y, Z. And, maybe they thank you in their paper or something. Is that enough for you to support? I mean, there are philanthropic individuals with like deeply interested in, securing a legacy or just moving the needle on an issue they care about. I'm not sure those incentives really are the same for a large crowd of people. What do you get as a Patreon supporter of? I mean, if you're supporting on Patreon a YouTuber, and I do support a couple, mostly things my son likes, you maybe get like insider access to some video that other people don't see, or you get to vote on something, or there's some like channel of communication to the creator, or at least an imagined channel of communication. Are you thinking something like that for these like Patreon supported independent researchers? Or is it just more pure
it's
gift?
a good question. I don't have an answer for what the equivalent model would be for the production of knowledge as opposed to the production of entertainment content or something like that. It's a perfectly valid question, and one could certainly ask, maybe it just isn't sustainable as a enterprise based model. So yeah, I guess it would depend on how they're positioned. Like Patreon is it's an alternative to something, right? You're paying you're providing patronage to a content producer and then consuming that content as an alternative to producing conventional media content, right? Like made by a film studio or a television studio or whatever. You're supporting an individual to get that. And then, in parallel, as a parallel to that, you could say, well, maybe somebody with deep pockets would patronize an individual researcher rather than obtaining the same product, the same results, the knowledge produced by contributing, by funding a nonprofit organization or giving grants to a university or paying a consultancy to produce a report and so forth. So you might position it in alternation or in contrast to the existing ways of obtaining the same utility, the same value from existing institutions. But I mean, I'm hardly convinced that this is viable. It's just a back of the envelope kind of idea. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I suppose the other thing that's possible is that rich people just kind of probably privately and quietly do, just support scientists that they become fans of for whatever reason. Maybe it's already a thing and it's just kind of quiet. I think that for example, very unsavourily, Jeffrey Epstein was an example of someone like that, someone with very deep pockets who funneled money to scientists, and I don't know the exact reasons why. Seems like that he was a very complicated situation. Don't know what's necessarily, there's rumors that he wasn't even operating in the capacity of a rich individual, but that he was basically, some intelligence agency pawn, and focused on gathering compromising information, compromat on influential people. But certainly he, for whatever reason, he was active in supporting individual scientists in the scientific community. So maybe there's a healthy version of what Epstein was doing.
Flip the sign on Epstein.
On that, Jesus.
That's a good idea. Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
Minus
what
Epstein.
have I done to myself?
That's the conclusion of this conversation. That's who we need. Anybody want to touch on any of these topics before we wrap up? Okay, I think there's plenty to pick up on next time. So good. If on the Discord there's any aspect of this you think we should specifically pick up at the beginning of next seminar, please comment.